Hey everyone, hope you're having a great day. I'm Ashley Nate. This is Talk Real Estate Tuesdays, where I go live about relevant real estate topics every Tuesday. So we're going to jump right into it. And today we are going to talk a little bit about equity, but more specifically negative equity. Because if you've been following along in the news and the headlines lately, you might have seen that apparently there is a growing or maybe a little bit larger number of homeowners that have negative equity in the United States. But this is why we're going to talk about this, because I do not want those headlines to scare you, because they're lacking context as to the full story, as many news stories tend to these days. Since I've had a lot of conversations with people on this topic as well, people worried about being upside down, where's the market going to go, what if that happens? People are scared about headlines because, again, like we just said, headlines tend to not include the full context, and they're all about clicks, not necessarily informing. But since I've had a lot of these conversations, I thought it would be a good topic to hop on here and delve into a little bit deeper. So we're going to talk about negative equity, or in other words, being upside down or underwater on your mortgage, or in other words, meaning that you owe more on your mortgage than your home is worth. So apparently one piece of data that is floating around from Black Knight, who puts out real estate data reports, is that of the homes purchased in 2022, 8% are now at least marginally underwater, and about 40% have less than 10% equity in their homes, okay? Now, let's unpack that for a moment, because if we just saw a headline that said homeowners are seeing unprecedented levels of negative equity, that's one thing. But here, even within this statement, we have the context. What we need to remember is we are talking about 2022. If we're talking about homeowners that have negative equity that bought 10 years ago, now that's a big problem. But if we're talking about people that bought just last year, that's a totally different story. And that's the context that's important when we're talking about this sort of an issue. So we're talking specifically about homes that were purchased in 2022. Well, what happened during the 2022 real estate market? We know that things were crazy. Things were going above asking. Some people were even willingly choosing to pay for their house more than the market value was, because there was such limited inventory. People wanted to get houses while they had those super low 2% interest rates. And so people were even willing to be under kind of right out the gate in doing that, or pay more than market value, I should say, in doing that. So it's important to keep that context in mind, that 2022 was a weird year, and home appreciation was soaring up into the point where it kind of hit its peak around March and April. And since then, appreciation has been just simply slowing down back to normal levels, or more stagnant. Now, maybe in some big metros where things were extra heightened, there's been some depreciation. But as I've talked about in several other lives, what we're seeing mostly is more of the appreciation slowing down, or a deceleration. Not that people's home values aren't going up, but just that it's slowing down. So slowing down and kind of remaining stagnant. But for those people who bought at that peak in 2022, if they put little money down, or if they paid for over what the market value was, and now we're seeing that deceleration, then yes, maybe marginally at this time they're slightly underwater. Does that mean that they should panic? I would say no, not necessarily, because think about real estate. When we buy real estate, do you buy a house with the intention to sell it in 6 months or in a year? Not typically. Not if you're talking about your primary residence. Now, we can talk about flippers and investors, and that's obviously a whole different story. Now, if we're talking about your primary residence, typically people are going to live there for several years before thinking about moving. So if you are marginally underwater for a few months or for a year, keep in mind that the real estate is about the long-term game and the long-term investment. And so the longer that you're in the house, the more you are going to see that appreciation come up, and also you're going to be paying down your principal. I've said this many times in other lives, but the historical annualized average appreciation on real estate from 1928 until today is 4.2% per year. So even if this year is a year that we don't hit that number, as you're holding on to real estate over the course of many years, that's what that annualized average appreciation tends to be. So many of those people are going to continue hanging on. And even again, if you're marginally underwater during that period, it's not necessarily cause for you to panic, especially if you have no intention of selling in the near future. So if you're hanging on to that property, and I don't suspect that, and this is my personal opinion, but I don't suspect that it's going to take very long if you are one of those 2022 buyers and you are seeing that where you're just slightly below what that, or your value is slightly below your loan. Maybe you put, you really wanted to get into a home because there's those great interest rates and you did zero money down and now you're kind of just sitting like right below. I really don't think it's going to take very long to go right back above there and start, flip it back over right side up as that appreciation comes from living in the house more years and as you pay down the principal. And then also you have to remember you can have forced appreciation as well as you're doing updates and things like that. The 4.2% appreciation that I'm talking about, that doesn't have anything to do with the updates and the things you're doing. That's just kind of the natural sort of inflation of how the housing prices over time as they've been seen, like I said, statistically. But if you're doing updates to the house, that's even going to increase that appreciation even faster. So all that to say, there's a lot of context and a lot more to it than to just instantly say, oh my gosh, that's terrible, I need to panic. And I hope that helped you kind of walk through and explain that a little bit more. So with the recent market conditions, in those first 6 months or first year, if you were a buyer last year, you likely didn't see a significant equity gain right on the front end now. But as you hang on there, as real estate has proven to do over time, you will likely see that appreciation pick back up as you pay your principal down also. So you're going to be going both ways in positive directions. That will be great for increasing your home equity, which is the number one greatest part about owning real estate, is building up that equity over time. It's a great way. I'd say the number one way to build net worth. So anyways, this is kind of a long ramble, but just a topic that I came across a couple times, had a couple conversations with people. I thought it would be maybe helpful to kind of run through that a little bit and just kind of give my 2 cents on it. I'm not saying that you should go out and pay over market value for a house or purposely put yourself into a bad situation, but you do have to keep the context of this market and this economy in mind, and remember that you're thinking long term. So there's a lot of moving parts, there's a lot of things to consider, and I don't want you to just automatically assume that it should be something that you should panic about. And I will also say, go back to my previous episodes, it's also highly, highly unlikely that we're going to see a crash. So if you're worried that you don't want to buy now because then we're going to have a 2008 style crash, I would argue that per the statistics and the data, watch my live last week, I talked about that very topic. It's really unlikely that's going to happen. So long story short, don't worry, be happy. It's all good. You'll get that appreciation over time. But anyways, that's enough of that. I hope that was helpful, and I hope you guys have a great rest of your day. If you have any ideas for future topics, I think I'm going to start getting into some investing things moving forward, talking about how to analyze cash flow on a rental property, talking about short-term rentals and things like that. But if you have ideas, please let me know. Otherwise, I hope you have a great rest of your week, and I will see you next Tuesday. Bye.